Nobody expected this to age the way it did. When Elle Duncan went on ESPN and suggested that Caitlin Clark's fans were sucking the life out of the WNBA, it sounded bold, confident, even righteous. At the time, it felt like one of those takes that gets applause in the studio and praise on social media. The kind of comment that positions the speaker as a protector of the game, someone brave enough to say the uncomfortable truth. But here's the problem. Fast forward just a short time later, and the entire league is facing something much more uncomfortable than a hot take. Viewership is slipping. Fan enthusiasm has cooled. Labor tensions are rising. New projects are struggling to hold attention. And suddenly, the very fans who were blamed for ruining the league are nowhere to be found. That's when people started replaying the clip. Not to argue with it, not to debate it, but to ask a much simpler question. How did this go so wrong so fast? Because what once sounded like a confident media stance now feels like a massive misread of reality. And not just by Elle Duncan, but by a larger group of voices inside women's basketball who believed they understood growth, fandom, and momentum, right up until the numbers stopped backing them up. This isn't just about one ESPN segment. It's not even just about Caitlin Clark. This is about how a league finally touched the mainstream, and then seemed almost irritated by the people who showed up. It's about how media voices framed new interest as a threat instead of an opportunity. And it's about how a single comment ended up symbolizing a mindset that quietly pushed fans away at the exact moment the WNBA needed them most. And the worst part? Nobody forced this collapse in momentum. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad luck. It was self-inflicted. Because when you tell fans they're the problem, eventually they listen. And what happened next exposed everything. When Elle Duncan made her comments on ESPN, the timing couldn't have been more critical. The WNBA was riding something it hadn't felt in decades, sustained attention. Not a one-week spike. Not a viral moment. Real, measurable interest. Games were selling out in cities that had never seen that kind of demand. Television ratings weren't just improving, they were breaking past old ceilings. Sports shows that once ignored the league were suddenly dedicating long segments to it, debating games, players, and storylines like they actually mattered. This was supposed to be the payoff moment. Years of grow the game messaging. Years of fighting for coverage. Years of being told the audience just wasn't there. And then Caitlin Clark arrives, and everything changes almost overnight. That's what made Duncan's comments hit so hard. Instead of framing the surge of new fans as the breakthrough the league had been chasing, she framed them as a problem. Not confused newcomers. Not passionate rivals. But something darker, something draining. As if their presence came with a cost. As if their attention wasn't clean enough, educated enough, or respectful enough to count. The tone mattered more than the words. Because this wasn't said cautiously. It wasn't framed as concern. It came across as dismissal. Like the league was finally popular. And some people didn't like who was responsible for that popularity. And fans noticed immediately. The reaction wasn't outrage at first. It was confusion. People replayed the clip asking themselves what they had done wrong. Was watching games suddenly the wrong reason? Was showing up late to the party a crime? Was discovering the WNBA through Caitlin Clark somehow disrespectful to everyone who came before her? That confusion quickly turned into frustration. Because the facts didn't line up with the narrative being pushed. Attendance was up. Ratings were up. Merchandise sales were up. Media coverage was up. Yet somehow, the message being sent was that all of this came with an asterisk, that the wrong fans had arrived. That's a dangerous thing to say out loud in sports. Because fandom doesn't work on permission. People don't apply for approval before they care. They show up because something pulls them in. And Caitlin Clark pulled people in at a scale the league hadn't seen before. What made the comment even more jarring was where it came from. This wasn't a random social media voice. This wasn't a disgruntled former player. This was a prominent ESPN personality, someone whose words carry weight, whether intended or not. When someone in that position frames fans as a threat, it doesn't stay theoretical. It shapes how people talk. It shapes how players respond. It shapes how other media voices feel empowered to speak. And suddenly, Duncan's take wasn't isolated anymore. It echoed a broader frustration that had been building under the surface. A frustration that the league's biggest moment of growth wasn't unfolding the right way. That Caitlin Clark was getting too much attention. That casual fans didn't know enough history. That newcomers didn't appreciate the grind that came before. Instead of seeing this as the start of something bigger, it was treated like an invasion. And here's the irony. Before Caitlin Clark, the WNBA didn't suffer from too many opinions. It suffered from too few people caring at all. For over 20 years, the league survived with limited exposure, empty seats in many markets, and financial losses covered largely by the NBA. That's not disrespect, it's documented reality. The WNBA existed, but it lived on the margins of mainstream sports conversation. Then suddenly that changed. And instead of asking, how do we keep this momentum? Some voices asked, why are these people here? That shift in mindset is what made Duncan's comment so revealing. Because it wasn't just wrong, it was disconnected from how sports have always worked. Leagues don't grow evenly. Attention doesn't distribute fairly. Popularity follows stars, moments, and narratives that hook people emotionally. It always has. It always will. Michael Jordan didn't make basketball popular by honoring its history. Tiger Woods didn't grow golf by waiting his turn. Serena Williams didn't elevate tennis by blending in. Stars disrupt ecosystems. And Caitlin Clark was doing exactly that. But instead of embracing the disruption, Duncan's comment framed it as damage, as something harmful, as if growth only counts when it arrives politely and quietly. That's when the backlash truly started. Because fans didn't feel corrected, they felt blamed. And once that line is crossed, it's almost impossible to walk back. People don't stick around to be lectured. They don't stay loyal to spaces where their enthusiasm is treated like a nuisance. At the time, though, many dismissed the criticism. It's just one comment. It's being taken out of context. This will blow over. But it didn't, because the comment didn't disappear. It sat there, waiting. And as the season moved forward, as viewership shifted, as tensions grew, that clip started resurfacing. Not as controversy, but as evidence. Evidence that someone fundamentally misunderstood what was happening in front of them. And what followed next made that misunderstanding impossible to ignore. Here's where everything starts to unravel. Because even if someone felt uncomfortable with the Caitlin Clark boom, the raw numbers made Elle Duncan's take nearly impossible to defend. This wasn't a matter of opinion versus opinion. This was measurable reality versus narrative. For the first time in modern WNBA history, people weren't just casually tuning in, they were planning around games. Road arenas were selling out weeks in advance when the fever came to town. Ticket prices spiked. Secondary markets exploded. Television ratings jumped so sharply that even longtime skeptics inside sports media had to acknowledge something had changed. And yet, the messaging coming from certain media voices suggested this was somehow unhealthy. That contradiction is what made fans pause. Because nothing about the moment looked like a league being drained. It looked like a league finally being noticed. For years, supporters begged networks to take women's basketball seriously. They wanted analysis, debate, coverage that didn't feel like charity. Then, when ESPN and other outlets finally gave the WNBA extended segments, the reaction from inside the space wasn't celebration, it was suspicion. That's when the disconnect became obvious. Sports media doesn't run on fairness. It runs on demand. Shows like First Take don't dedicate 40-minute blocks to topics out of moral obligation. They do it because people are watching, clicking, arguing, and staying tuned through commercial breaks. Caitlin Clark wasn't dominating coverage because ESPN decided to be generous. She was dominating coverage because viewers wouldn't stop engaging. And when Clark wasn't playing, the coverage dropped. Not out of spite, not out of disrespect, but because the audience followed her. That's the part Duncan's take never accounted for. She spoke as if attention was being unfairly siphoned away from other players, when in reality, attention was being created, and then naturally concentrated around the person driving it. Before Clark, the WNBA didn't have a surplus of ignored stars waiting in line for national airtime. If that audience existed, networks would have chased it years earlier. Media companies don't leave money on the table out of ignorance. They follow eyeballs. That truth made Duncan's framing feel almost upside down. She suggested new fans were harming the league, while the league's strongest metrics in decades were happening at the exact same time those fans showed up. It forced people to ask whether the issue wasn't the fans, but the discomfort with why they arrived. Because Caitlin Clark didn't just bring attention. She brought a different audience. Casual viewers. Younger fans. People who didn't grow up following the WNBA. And instead of being welcomed, that audience was subtly treated like it didn't belong unless it passed a knowledge test. Know the history. Respect the past. Learn the names. Prove you're here for the right reasons. That's not how fandom works. Nobody demanded new NBA fans memorize ABA history before watching Michael Jordan. Nobody asked Tiger Woods viewers to study golf's past champions before tuning in. Sports grow when people feel pulled in, not when they feel evaluated. And here's where the take really started aging badly. As the season progressed, the surge didn't just plateau, it began to normalize, which is expected in any breakout moment. But instead of acknowledging that sustaining momentum requires nurturing fans, the earlier messaging had already done damage. People remembered how they were spoken to. They remembered being told they were part of the problem. So when viewership dipped slightly from its peak, the narrative quietly flipped. Suddenly, the same voices who dismissed new fans were wondering where the energy went. What changed? Why wasn't every game pulling record numbers anymore? The answer was sitting in plain sight. Fans don't stay where they feel unwanted. And the numbers reflected that shift in attitude. Interest didn't vanish overnight, it cooled. Engagement softened. Buzz fragmented. The league went from feeling like it was breaking through to feeling like it was struggling to hold on to what it had just gained. That's when people really started replaying Duncan's comment. Not because it was offensive, but because it was wrong. It misdiagnosed the moment entirely. The WNBA didn't have a fan problem. It had a messaging problem. Growth had arrived, but instead of being protected, it was questioned. Instead of being guided, it was challenged. And that challenge didn't motivate fans to learn more. It motivated them to disengage. Because attention is fragile. You don't get infinite chances to make a first impression. When someone discovers a league for the first time, they're deciding whether it's worth their time, money, and emotional investment. The moment they feel scolded instead of appreciated, that decision becomes very easy. They leave. This is where the conversation started expanding beyond Elle Duncan. Her comment became shorthand for a broader issue. A mindset that wanted the benefits of mainstream popularity without accepting its realities. Mainstream audiences don't arrive perfectly educated. They arrive curious. And curiosity only survives in environments that welcome it. Instead, what many fans saw was defensiveness. Defensiveness about star power. Defensiveness about coverage. Defensiveness about who deserved attention. That defensiveness showed up everywhere, in interviews, social media posts, and subtle jabs at casuals. Over time, it created an emotional barrier between the league and the very people it needed most. And that's when the situation crossed a point of no return. Because once fans stop feeling like partners in growth and start feeling like intruders, they don't argue. They don't protest. They don't announce their exit. They just disappear. And the league is still trying to figure out where they went. Caitlin Clark didn't just change ratings. She changed the conversation, and that's what made people uneasy. Because the moment she entered the league, she exposed something that had been quietly avoided for years. Not everyone wanted to say it out loud, but everyone could feel it. The WNBA had talent, it had competition, it had history, but it didn't have a singular gravitational force that pulled the broader sports world toward it on a nightly basis. Clark became that force almost instantly. And when that happens, it disrupts more than defenses. It disrupts hierarchies, expectations, and narratives that took years to build. It forces uncomfortable comparisons. It reframes what value looks like in a media-driven ecosystem. That's why the reaction around her wasn't just praise, it was tension. Some celebrated the moment for what it was, a breakthrough. Others treated it like a problem to manage. Because once one player becomes the clear entry point for millions of new viewers, it challenges the idea that attention should be evenly distributed. And sports have never worked that way. Star power doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait its turn. It doesn't spread itself out politely so everyone feels included. It concentrates. It dominates. And it forces leagues to either lean into the moment or resist it. The WNBA, whether it realized it or not, was being asked to make that choice. Caitlin Clark didn't become the face of the league because ESPN decided to crown her. She became the face because people wouldn't stop watching her. They followed her from college to the pros. They tuned in even when her team struggled. They bought tickets in cities where WNBA games rarely sold out. That kind of pull isn't manufactured. It's organic. And organic star power is dangerous to anyone invested in the idea that all recognition must be earned slowly, evenly, and quietly. Clark didn't climb a ladder. She crashed through the ceiling. That's why some of the pushback sounded personal. Not overtly hostile, not openly dismissive, but laced with discomfort. Comments about her fans. Comments about overexposure. Comments about how the league had plenty of stars already. All technically true statements, but emotionally loaded ones. Because none of those stars were doing what Clark was doing to the audience. The truth is, most leagues would kill for this problem. One player pulling casual viewers into the ecosystem creates opportunities for everyone else. It creates cross-interest. It creates storylines. It creates curiosity. But that only works if the league and its voices embrace the moment instead of pushing against it. Instead, what fans saw was friction. They saw Clark celebrated in one breath and resented in the next. They saw her impact acknowledged publicly and questioned privately. They saw her name drive headlines while people insisted she wasn't more important than anyone else. That contradiction confused new fans. Because from their perspective, it was simple. Clark was why they were watching. She wasn't the only reason, but she was the reason they started. And when they sensed that their entry point wasn't fully welcome, it created distance. That's where the uncomfortable truth comes in. Caitlin Clark revealed that the league didn't just want growth, it wanted controlled growth. Growth that arrived without disrupting existing narratives. Growth that didn't elevate one player too fast. Growth that didn't expose disparities in draw, coverage, and interest. But that kind of growth doesn't exist. Every major sports breakthrough has a face. Magic and Bird. Jordan. Kobe. LeBron. Curry. Those players didn't just succeed, they changed who was watching. And every time, there was resistance. Claims of overhyping. Complaints about media obsession. Warnings about overshadowing others. The difference is that those leagues leaned in anyway. They understood something crucial. You don't grow by telling people to stop caring. You grow by giving them more reasons to care, and then expanding the story outward. The WNBA was at that exact crossroads. Caitlin Clark wasn't diminishing anyone else's career. She was expanding the audience. But expansion comes with noise, imbalance, and discomfort. And instead of accepting that, some voices tried to neutralize it. That's why Duncan's comment resonated beyond its moment. It tapped into a fear that the league's identity was being rewritten by someone new, that the history was being overshadowed, that longtime supporters were being replaced by people who didn't get it. But fans don't replace each other. They add to the total. The mistake was treating growth like a zero-sum game, as if Clark's rise automatically meant someone else's value was being erased, as if attention was a finite resource that had to be rationed fairly. In reality, attention expands, but only when people feel welcome. Instead, the message many heard was defensive. Defensive about status. Defensive about credit. Defensive about who deserved spotlight. That defensiveness didn't just slow momentum. It reframed Clark's success as something suspicious. And once that frame was introduced, it became easier to question everything tied to her rise. Her fans, her coverage, her impact. That's when the conversation shifted from celebration to control. And once a league starts trying to control enthusiasm instead of channel it, the outcome is almost always the same. Because the audience doesn't wait to be corrected. They move on. At the heart of this entire situation is an idea that sounds good in theory, but collapses the moment it meets reality. The idea that the WNBA could grow without centering around a single star. Not just grow, but explode into the mainstream without attaching that growth to a face, a name, or a personality that casual fans could latch onto immediately. That belief shaped a lot of the reaction to Caitlin Clark's rise, even when people didn't say it outright. You could hear it in the language. You could feel it in the frustration. The coverage was treated like something unfair rather than inevitable, as if attention itself had made a mistake. The problem is that sports history does not support this idea at all. Every major leap into mainstream relevance has come through individuals, not collectives. Fans don't fall in love with leagues, they fall in love with players. Leagues come later. Identity follows connection, not the other way around. Yet, during Clark's surge, the messaging from some media figures suggested that focusing on one player was somehow harmful, that it overshadowed others, that it simplified the league too much, that it distorted the true product. But that argument ignores how people actually consume sports. Casual fans don't arrive seeking balance. They arrive seeking intrigue. They want a story that makes sense immediately, a name they recognize, a reason to tune in tonight instead of scrolling past. Caitlin Clark provided that. And the coverage followed because it had to. Networks aren't emotional about this. They're analytical. They track minute-by-minute engagement. They know exactly when viewers changed the channel. When Clark played, people stayed. When she didn't, many didn't. That isn't favoritism, it's feedback. The mistake was treating that feedback as a moral problem instead of a business reality. Some voices acted as if ESPN was choosing Clark over the league, when in reality ESPN was responding to what the audience was doing in real time. The attention wasn't stolen, it was pulled. And that's where the phrase growth without a face becomes so revealing, because it implies discomfort with the messiness of popularity, with the imbalance, with the reality that not all excellence generates the same response. The WNBA has always had elite talent. What it hadn't consistently had was mass emotional connection. Clark created that connection quickly, loudly, and in a way that couldn't be ignored. Instead of building outward from that moment, there was an attempt to shrink it, to remind fans that the league was bigger than one player, to correct the narrative rather than ride it. That approach misunderstands how narratives work. You don't correct people into caring more. You let them care first, then you expand their understanding over time. The NBA didn't start by telling fans to appreciate role players. The NFL didn't grow by emphasizing balance across all teams. They let stars hook the audience, then used that attention to showcase everything else. The WNBA had that chance. And the reaction to Clark suggests many inside the space weren't ready for it. Because embracing a star means accepting uncomfortable truths. It means acknowledging that some players move the needle more than others. That media coverage will never feel perfectly fair. That popularity isn't a merit badge, it's a reaction. That's a hard pill to swallow in a league that prides itself on collective identity and shared struggle. But ignoring that reality doesn't make it go away. Instead, what happened was subtle resistance. Comments about overexposure. Eye rolls at extended coverage. Framing fans as uninformed or problematic. Suggesting that attention had arrived in the wrong way. That resistance created friction. New fans sensed it immediately. They could tell they were entering a space that didn't fully want them unless they behaved correctly. And when enthusiasm meets resistance, enthusiasm fades. This is where media responsibility comes into play. Because when prominent voices frame growth as suspicious, it validates that resistance. It gives cover to players and fans who feel irritated by the attention shift. It normalizes the idea that popularity itself needs to be managed, monitored, or criticized. Elle Duncan didn't invent that mindset. She voiced it. And once it was voiced on a platform like ESPN, it stopped being a private discomfort and became a public narrative. That narrative told fans something very clear. Your interest is conditional. You can watch. You can cheer. But don't change the hierarchy. Don't disrupt the balance. Don't let one player become too important. That's not how mainstream audiences behave. Mainstream audiences gravitate toward extremes, toward dominance, toward spectacle, and Caitlin Clark gave them all three. Trying to suppress that instead of channel it is how momentum gets lost. And once momentum is lost, getting it back is never guaranteed. Here's the part that still doesn't get talked about enough. Fans didn't wake up one day and decide they hated the WNBA. There wasn't some coordinated backlash. There wasn't a sudden wave of bad faith. What happened was much quieter and much more damaging. They stopped feeling welcome. That shift didn't happen overnight. It happened in layers. A comment here, a tone there, a growing sense that enthusiasm came with conditions attached. That if you didn't speak the right way, watch the right players, or frame your interest correctly, you were part of the problem. For new fans especially, that feeling is lethal. Most of them weren't trying to reshape the league's identity. They weren't demanding anything. They were just watching games, buying tickets, arguing on social media, and enjoying basketball. Caitlin Clark was their entry point, not their manifesto. But instead of being met with excitement, they were met with suspicion. Suspicion that they were only here for one player. Suspicion that they didn't respect the league's past. Suspicion that their interest was shallow or temporary. Over time, that suspicion became exhausting. Because fandom is emotional. People invest time, money, and attention. And when they feel like that investment isn't appreciated, they pull back. Not angrily. Not loudly. They just disengage. That's what made this situation so dangerous. There was no obvious breaking point. No singular scandal. Just a slow erosion of goodwill. Fans noticed how often they were talked about instead of talked to, how often their motives were questioned, how frequently excitement was framed as ignorance. And the message became clear: your presence is tolerated, not celebrated. That's when interest started cooling. Not collapsing, cooling. Viewership didn't crash. It softened. Engagement dipped. Buzz fragmented. Instead of one growing conversation, there were smaller, disconnected ones. That's far worse than outrage, because outrage keeps people involved. Indifference doesn't. And this is where the earlier comments started aging rapidly. Because once fans disengaged, the same voices who dismissed their importance began noticing the absence. Ratings weren't climbing the way they were expected to. New projects struggled to maintain attention. The energy that made last season feel special wasn't carrying forward. People started asking what changed. The answer wasn't complicated. You don't get to lecture people into loyalty. Fans don't owe leagues anything. They don't have a responsibility to stick around through discomfort. They're not employees. They're customers, emotionally and financially. And when customers feel blamed, they leave. What made it worse was that many fans wanted to stay. They were excited. They were ready to learn. They were open to discovering more players, more teams, more history. But curiosity dies quickly when it's treated like ignorance. Instead of being guided deeper into the league, many felt pushed to the margins, like they needed to justify why they were watching at all. And that's when enthusiasm turns into silence. Silence is deadly in sports. No think pieces, no arguments, no engagement, just fewer eyes. And that's exactly what started showing up in the numbers. Not dramatically, not headline-grabbing, but consistently enough to raise quiet concern. This is where the narrative flips in a way few expected. Because when fan sentiment softened, sympathy didn't automatically flow toward players. In fact, something unusual started happening. Fans began emotionally distancing themselves from player-driven messaging altogether. Not because they hated the players, but because they felt talked down to. They felt like their role in the league's growth was minimized or dismissed. That showing interest wasn't enough. It had to be the right kind of interest. And once that feeling sets in, fans stop defending the league in public. They stop amplifying it. They stop correcting critics. They stop showing up consistently. Support becomes conditional or disappears entirely. This is the invisible cost of messaging. You can't track it easily. You don't see it immediately. But once it accumulates, it changes the entire emotional ecosystem around a sport. That's why the next moment mattered so much. Because when a respected voice inside the game finally acknowledged this shift, it confirmed what fans had already been feeling, and it signaled that the league might have misread the room entirely. And that voice was Rebecca Lobo. When Rebecca Lobo started speaking up, the conversation changed instantly. Not because she was louder than everyone else. Not because she was chasing attention, but because she carries something almost no one else in the space does. Credibility without agenda. Lobo isn't a hot-take artist. She isn't a social media personality. She isn't someone who benefits from stirring controversy or feeding narratives. She's a Hall of Famer, a foundational figure in women's basketball, and someone who lived through the league's leanest years firsthand. When someone like that starts hinting that something feels off, people listen. And what she said, and how she said it, mattered more than any viral clip. Lobo didn't attack fans. She didn't scold them. She didn't accuse them of misunderstanding the game. Instead, she acknowledged a reality that many were pretending not to see. Public opinion was shifting. That alone was a massive statement. Because in almost every sports labor or cultural dispute, fans instinctively side with players. They see athletes as underdogs fighting powerful ownership. That's the default dynamic. But Lobo subtly pointed out that this situation was different. Fans weren't rallying the same way. Not because they suddenly loved ownership. Not because they opposed player empowerment. But because they felt disconnected from the messaging coming from the player side. That disconnect didn't happen randomly. It was the accumulation of everything that came before. The tone, the frustration toward new fans, the resistance to Caitlin Clark's impact, the sense that interest came with judgment attached. Lobo recognized that before many others did. She spoke about perspective, about how far the league had come compared to earlier eras. She referenced playing in small gyms, practicing in limited facilities, and surviving without the support systems players now have. Not to diminish current struggles, but to contextualize them. That context mattered, because when fans heard the details being discussed publicly, salaries climbing, benefits expanding, real investment happening. It didn't line up with the level of outrage they were being asked to feel. Lobo wasn't saying players shouldn't push for more. She was saying messaging matters. And that was the quiet alarm bell. She pointed out that the deal on the table, by any reasonable standard, looked strong. That it represented real progress. That the league was finally in a position to negotiate from stability instead of survival. For longtime fans and new ones alike, that perspective landed differently than the more confrontational language they'd been hearing. It sounded grounded. It sounded honest. It sounded aware of optics. And optics are everything when your league depends on public goodwill. Because fans aren't sitting in negotiation rooms. They're watching from the outside, trying to decide who they emotionally align with. And when messaging feels exaggerated or dismissive, alignment shifts. That's what made Lobo's comments so impactful. She wasn't undermining players. She was protecting the league. She understood something crucial. Trust is fragile. And once fans feel like they're being spoken down to, they don't rush back to defend anyone. They disengage and let things play out without them. That's exactly what started happening. The moment Lobo acknowledged that public opinion was drifting, it validated what fans had already felt but hadn't articulated. That something about the tone had gone wrong. That the league might be misjudging how it was being perceived. And suddenly, the narrative changed. This wasn't about whether players deserved more. It was about whether fans felt respected enough to care. That shift put everyone else on notice. Because if someone with Lobo's history and loyalty to the game was urging caution, it meant the issue wasn't imaginary. It was structural, and it had consequences. From that point on, every public comment carried more weight. Every interview was scrutinized. Every message was filtered through a new question. Who are you talking to, and how does it sound to them? That question became unavoidable as the season moved forward. And the next phase of the story shows exactly how that tension spilled into labor discussions, and why fan sympathy started landing in unexpected places. Labor disputes usually follow a familiar script. Players speak up. Fans rally behind them. Ownership gets framed as the obstacle. That's how it works in most leagues. But this time, something strange happened. As labor discussions became more public, fan reaction didn't follow the expected pattern. Instead of rallying loudly behind the players, many fans stayed quiet. Others expressed confusion. Some even started questioning the framing of the dispute altogether. That alone was unusual. And the reason wasn't that fans suddenly became anti-player. It was that the messaging no longer matched the emotional reality they were experiencing. Details started coming out. Not leaks. Not rumors. Publicly discussed terms. Rising maximum salaries. Significant average salary increases. Revenue sharing structures. Long-term investment commitments. For fans who had just been told the league was finally growing, those numbers sounded like progress, not exploitation. And when some players described the offers as insulting, it created a disconnect that was hard to reconcile, especially for newer fans. They weren't steeped in the league's history of underpayment. They didn't experience the worst years. What they saw was a league gaining attention, money starting to flow in, and players publicly expressing dissatisfaction at a moment that many fans viewed as upward momentum. The emotional math didn't add up, and tone mattered more than facts. Language like slap in the face landed differently when paired with headlines about expanding benefits, improved facilities, and financial stability that hadn't existed before. Fans weren't rejecting the idea of players pushing for more. They were struggling to understand why the messaging felt so absolute. This is where Rebecca Lobo's earlier comments came into sharper focus. She wasn't saying players were wrong to negotiate aggressively. She was saying the way it was being communicated risked alienating the very audience that made those negotiations possible. And that risk became real fast. Because fans don't evaluate labor talks through spreadsheets. They evaluate them emotionally. They ask simple questions. Does this feel reasonable? Does this feel honest? Does this feel respectful? When the answers to those questions become uncertain, support softens. And once support softens, something rare happens. Fans stop instinctively siding with the players. Not out of spite, but out of distance. They emotionally step back and let the dispute play out without taking a side. And in the absence of vocal fan backing, ownership narratives suddenly gain ground by default. That's exactly what started happening. It wasn't that fans suddenly trusted ownership more. It was that they trusted the messaging from players less. And that shift was subtle but powerful. It showed up in comment sections. It showed up in radio calls. It showed up in online discourse that felt more divided than unified. And all of it traced back to the same issue. Fans didn't feel like partners in the league's growth anymore. They felt like spectators being told what to think and how to react. That's a dangerous place to be during negotiations, because public sympathy is leverage. Once that leverage weakens, everything becomes harder. Messaging gets scrutinized. Statements get replayed. Old comments resurface, including Elle Duncan's. Her earlier framing of fans as a problem suddenly looked even worse in this context. Not just wrong, but counterproductive. Because by the time labor tensions rose, the league couldn't afford to have fans already emotionally disengaged. But that's exactly where things stood. The goodwill cushion that usually protects players in public disputes was thinner than expected. And the reason wasn't economics, it was tone. Which leads directly to the next turning point. Because when the league tried to showcase unity and energy during a marquee moment, the cracks became impossible to ignore, and fan perception shifted even further. At some point, the debate stopped being theoretical. It stopped being about tone, messaging, or intent. It became about results. Because once the league moved into spaces where Caitlin Clark wasn't present, the contrast became impossible to ignore. New projects launched. Games were showcased. Opportunities were given to prove that the momentum could stand on its own. And the audience response was quiet. Not hostile. Not dismissive. Just absent. This is where the concept of star power stopped being an opinion and became a measurement. When Clark wasn't involved, viewership didn't hold steady. It didn't transfer cleanly. It dipped, sometimes sharply. Broadcast windows that were expected to carry momentum struggled to keep attention. For a league that had just experienced a surge, that drop-off felt jarring. And this wasn't an indictment of talent. It wasn't a claim that other players weren't skilled, competitive, or entertaining. It was something much more uncomfortable. They didn't move the needle on their own. That distinction matters. Professional sports are full of elite athletes who don't pull casual viewers. Star power isn't about ability alone, it's about connection. It's about narrative gravity. It's about being the reason someone who isn't already invested chooses to watch. Caitlin Clark had that pull. Most players didn't. Saying that out loud made people uncomfortable because it challenged the idea that attention should naturally distribute itself once fans arrived. But attention doesn't work that way. It concentrates around what feels urgent, compelling, and easy to follow. Clark's story was easy to follow. Record-setting college career. Immediate transition to the pros. Visible pressure. Every game framed as a moment. That kind of clarity is gold in sports media. Other storylines required context, time, emotional investment. And for fans who were already feeling uncertain about their place in the league's ecosystem, that investment felt risky. So they didn't make it. This is where projects like Unrivaled quietly exposed the gap. It was promoted as a showcase, a chance to prove that interest wasn't tied to one name, that fans were here for the league, not a player. That star power could be spread. But when the numbers came in, they told a different story. Exposure didn't equal engagement. Major platforms, heavy promotion, top-level talent, and still, the audience didn't follow. That wasn't a failure of effort. It was a reality check. It showed that Caitlin Clark wasn't just a piece of the momentum, she was the engine. And instead of building infrastructure around that engine, the league and its voices had spent months questioning whether it should be driving at all. Fans noticed that too. Because they weren't stupid. They could see the difference in energy. They could feel the drop-off. And they connected it back to how they'd been treated earlier. Why invest emotionally in something that seemed resentful of what drew you in? This is where the everyone's a star narrative collapsed under its own weight. In theory, it sounds empowering. In practice, it ignores how audiences behave. Fans don't attach emotionally to balance. They attach to peaks, to dominance, to contrast. The WNBA finally had that peak. And instead of amplifying it, the league hesitated. That hesitation didn't just slow growth, it confused fans. It made them question whether their interest aligned with the league's direction at all. And once that doubt sets in, rebuilding trust becomes exponentially harder. Because fans don't need perfection. They need clarity. They need to feel like their attention matters. That their reasons for watching aren't being judged. That the league understands why they showed up. Caitlin Clark gave the WNBA a clear story. What followed muddied it. And by the time the gap in star power became obvious through ratings and engagement, the damage to momentum had already been done. Which brings everything back to the moment that started this conversation in the first place. Because once the numbers told the truth, Elle Duncan's comment didn't just age badly. It became a symbol. And that's exactly where this story heads next. By the time the season wrapped and the numbers settled, there was no need for outrage anymore. The data spoke for itself. That's what made Elle Duncan's earlier comment resurface with so much force. Not because people were looking to drag her, but because the situation she dismissed had quietly proven her wrong. The fans she described as a problem were gone. Or more accurately, they stopped showing up the same way. Viewership softened. Engagement fractured. Projects designed to sustain momentum struggled to find an audience. The league didn't collapse, but the energy that made it feel unstoppable a year earlier was noticeably thinner. That's when the clip stopped being a hot take and started being a receipt. Because in hindsight, the idea that new fans were sucking the life out of the league feels almost inverted. If anything, those fans were supplying oxygen. And when they felt unwelcome, the air thinned. Duncan didn't cause that outcome, but she articulated the mindset that allowed it to happen. A mindset that treated growth as something suspicious. That viewed star-driven attention as distortion rather than opportunity. That believed fans should arrive already educated, already aligned, already compliant with how the league wanted to be consumed. That mindset collided with reality. Sports don't grow on internal approval. They grow on external interest. And once that interest is discouraged, it doesn't argue. It leaves. What makes this moment especially revealing is how quietly it unfolded. There was no dramatic exodus. No trending hashtag. No coordinated backlash. Just fewer people watching, fewer casual conversations, fewer reasons for media to linger. That's the most dangerous kind of decline, because it doesn't feel urgent until it's already entrenched. And suddenly, the league found itself in a strange position. After years of being ignored, it was now struggling to hold attention. Not because it lacked talent, but because it had mishandled connection. Duncan's comment, when viewed in isolation, could have been brushed off. But when placed against the arc of the season, it became emblematic of a broader failure to read the room. She wasn't alone. She wasn't malicious. She was confident and wrong. And confidence is what made the comment stick. Because confident dismissal of fans is something people remember. Especially when they're the ones being dismissed. That's why her take continues to circulate. Not as a personal attack, but as a cautionary moment. A reminder that media voices don't just reflect culture, they shape it. When influential figures frame fans as a burden, it gives permission for that framing to spread. It normalizes frustration toward the audience. It reinforces the idea that popularity needs to be policed. And once that idea takes hold, growth becomes fragile. The irony is brutal. The league finally found a bridge to the mainstream, a player who made people care instantly. And instead of fortifying that bridge, some voices stood at the entrance questioning who should be allowed to cross. Now the bridge feels quieter. Rebecca Lobo's attempt to course-correct matters. It shows awareness. It shows that not everyone inside the game missed the warning signs. But rebuilding trust is always harder than preserving it. Fans don't rush back just because tone improves. They wait. They watch. They decide whether it feels safe to invest again. And that decision will shape the league's future far more than any single negotiation or media segment. Because growth doesn't happen on a league's terms. It happens on the audience's terms. And when the audience finally arrives, the worst possible move is to tell them they're the problem. The WNBA didn't lose momentum because fans were toxic. It didn't struggle because interest was fake. It didn't face tension because Caitlin Clark existed. It stumbled because it misunderstood the moment. Growth showed up loudly, unevenly, and attached to one name. That's how growth always shows up. And instead of embracing that reality, too many voices resisted it. Fans felt that resistance. They responded by stepping back. And now the league is trying to regain something that was once freely given. Attention. Momentum is fragile. Once it's questioned instead of protected, it doesn't magically return. If the league wants to move forward, it has to stop treating interest like something to manage and start treating it like something to nurture. Fans don't need to be corrected, they need to be welcomed. Because the next breakout moment might not come so easily. And when it does, how the league responds will determine whether history repeats itself or finally changes. If you want the real conversations behind these moments, the media moves nobody breaks down, and the stories shaping women's basketball before they hit the headlines. Make sure you're subscribed. This is where the full picture comes together.